Hi, these are to the parents out there that are listening. Today's story, and through the month of October, we're going to be reading Hocus Pocus. A warning to the kids that are younger than possibly 10 years old. This story does have scary elements, witches, evil things, and different things that possibly might want you to not let your kids that are under 10 years old listen to these story times in the month of October. If you've ever let your child under that age watch the Disney movie Hocus Pocus, then that's basically what this book is based off of. So just a little warning, before we start, that that there are some scary elements. There are some different elements that are for a little more older children from 10 and up than for those that are 10 and younger. So that being said, I hope you enjoy today's story time and the month of October while we're reading Hocus Pocus. It's story time with Jocelyn in the spooky month of October. And like I promised, this month we're going to be reading a tale about 3 sister witches. And what is that? Hocus Pocus! So let us begin with our tale. On All Hallows Eve, when the moon is round, a virgin will summon us from under the ground. We shall be back, and the lives of all the children of Salem shall be mine. Winifred Sanderson, on October 31st, 1693. Last words as recorded in the Journal of Samuel Paris. Wild things in Salem of 1693. This is a map of the Salem village in that time period. The world was full of wild things then. It brimmed with oak and hemlock and dark whispering places that turned you round and around until there was no turning back. The women folks said that on early mornings near the harbor you could hear echoes of witch song, which sounded like bird song, but more bitter. The men folks said godliness would save them from any witches, but they harned their axes and twisted new rope just the same. The witches said there was nothing so sweet as the sin bones of little girls, or perhaps a well-braced scapula with sparrow-spleened compote. It was all in the preparation. They lived near town, the witches, but not so near as to be a bother until a milk cow died or a child took sick. Then the town would start to mutter about the Sanderson girls, Mary and Sarah, and especially Winnie, who had not been girls for a very long time, but who did not merit the title ladies. Someone always intervened. "They're no bother," someone would say, "just batty girls playing in the woods." "Leave them be," someone would say. "Don't you remember how kind their mother was and how generous?" It all made perfect sense at the time, but once the people of Salem left the town meeting and went back to work, not one of them could remember who that someone had been. That is, until Emily went missing. Now we're in Salem of 1993. "Knock, knocks," said Danny, grinning up at her 16-year-old brother as she trotted down the sidewalk, leaves drifting through the air around them. Thin slips of yellow and broad, shaggy orange things, the size and the shape of their dad's hands, and the morning was just starting to break open and turn the world gold. Max rolled his eyes and swung his bike in a big loop to match her slow progress. "Jocelyn, can you please not?" It was Halloween, and the houses on both sides of the little neighborhood street were decked out with cobwebs and tombstones and giant spiders and jack-o'-lanterns, some of which were already starting to sag a little with mold. Danny giggled as she ran through the pale tendrils of a ghost hardled gathered in a tree. "Ta-da!" she said a little louder. Her pointed black hat sported a thin orange brim around the brim, which matched her sun-patterned jacket and striped skirt. She dressed as a witch, and in her own words, a fancy one. The grin she gave Max, though, was not impish than witchy. Max glanced behind them to make sure the street was still as deserted as when they had left for school. "Seriously, Danny, not the place." He should have known better than to talk about Allison Watts to Jack, because Jack still lived in Santa Monica and Max's house had a shared phone line and a nosy 8-year-old. "Yabos!" Danny squealed. Max blushed hard, looking over his shoulder. "I'm going to leave you," he said. "Find your own way to school." He spun around a loop, catching too much speed on the turn. He stopped short before hitting the curb. Danny stopped too, eyes sparkling with mischief beneath the brim of her witch's hat. A few strands of tawny hair stuck to her red lipstick. "Then Mom will ground you forever," she said. "Maybe that wouldn't be so bad," he muttered. Danny put a sympathetic hand on his shoulder. "Oh, don't be that way," she said. "Then how will you ever see Allison's bazookas?" Max groaned, leaning forward over his handlebars. "Please stop," he begged. "It's not even like that." "It sounded a lot like that." She tugged on her sleeve to get them moving again. Max relented, bike wobbling as he pedaled slowly beside his sister. "That's why you shouldn't eavesdrop on people," he said. "You lose context. One day you'll know what that means." "Does it mean you saving up to run away to Jack's house and become the next X-ray glasses?" "Because I heard about that too." "The X-ray spec," Max muttered. "You know, I don't have to walk you to school anymore if I don't want to." It was true. One of the few perks he had been promised about their family's move from LA to Salem was that they'd live far enough from school that Danny would qualify for bus pickup. But the previous night, she said the bus made her lonely, and she begged him to bike ahead and meet her one stop early so that they could walk the rest of the way together. He agreed against his better judgment. She was still his little sister after all. As long as she'd been going to school, they'd been walking together. But now he was paying the price for nostalgia. "But you do want to," said Danny, dancing through the graveyard on someone's front lawn. "Or you would have said no." She stepped on a button, and a plastic corpse with a matted black hair sat up with a shout, making her shriek and race back to the sidewalk. As they rounded the corner, Max saw at the top of the hill the skinny blonde and the no-necked bonehead known as Jay Ernie. In the 2 weeks since his family had moved to Salem, Max had avoided any run-ins with the town's bullies, but he could already tell that they were the kind of boys whose kindergarten teachers, searching for something nice to say during parent-teacher conferences, wouldn't settle on persistence. Jay and Ernie's lackeys seemed to appear out of nowhere as they swaggled down the middle of the road, the embellishments on their flex leather jackets gleaming in the morning light. "You know," said Max, wheeling around, "I think Mom told me they're handing out candy at the side entrance." He felt bad about lying to Danny, but she'd get more than enough airheads and pixie sticks later. "Hey!" she protested as they approached the annex door. "There's no candy!" But her brother was already gone, speeding off toward Jacob Bailey High. Salem in 1693. It was not unlike Emily Binks to stray so close to the wood. Her mother had often scolded her for doing precisely that, and though she tried not to scold too hard, for 9-year-old Emily was a serious child and pious, paging through her prayer book without minding where her footsteps took her. Emily was old enough to know the rumors about the Sanderson sisters, but she also knew that whenever she ran across any of them in town, they were kind to her. It was rare to see Miss Winnie or Miss Mary or Miss Sarah smile. What with that crooked backs and twisted and tasty and dusty faces, but when they noticed her, they beamed and they clapped. Well, Mary and Sarah anyway, and praised her pink cheeks and pretty hands. Her mother never praised those things for fear of encouraging vanity and sin. Even skeptical Mrs. Winnie would pat Emily's shoulder awkwardly and tease that she should return to her mother lest Winnie eat the little girl right up. All this to say that Emily was not afraid of the wood as others were, and were especially less afraid than her brother, Thackeray, who, like his best friend Elijah, was 7 years older than Emily and of age. When boys found anything at all to do with girls and women, highly suspect. So when the wood began to creep into her dreams, it didn't startle Emily. In her dreams, the field between Salem and the trees smelled of warm hay and fresh flowers, and its waves of trailing sweet grass tickled her arms and legs as she walked. In the dreams, the edge of the field ran right up to the edge of the wood and then stopped, as if perplexed about where to go to next. In the dreams, the wood was cool and welcoming, and the air tasted faintly damp of soil and crumbling bark, a taste that seemed as sweet as almond cake to young Emily, for it promised an adventure to rival her well-worn copy of Pilgrim's Progress. Thackeray had begun to dream of that place too, that nice edge between the world he knew and the world of witches. But his dreams were thick with moss-colored smoke and the press of hands upon his skin and the taste of sweet and bile and river muck. The dreams made him wake night after night, more tired than the day before, but he didn't tell his parents or his sister or even Elijah, for he feared the dreams meant something dark about his mind or worse, about his heart. Emily didn't tell because she was afraid her mother might scold her for letting her imagination run beyond the pages of her prayer book. And the other children didn't tell for their own reactions, each of them more personal than the next. Salem, 1993. Max was kneeling beside his bike, tying his shoelace, when a shadow spilled over his shoulder and onto the grass. He tensed, expecting Ernie's hot, pickled breath to run his shoulder any minute. To buy time, he undid his laces and tied them again carefully. The pristine white toe and accents of the otherwise black Nikes started to blur as Max considered the best way to slip away unscarred. He wasn't about to let some mouth breather spit on his new sneakers just to get a rise out of him. He had only gotten them as a pity gift from his parents when they announced their surprise move to the place with the witches' trials, Massachusetts. "You dressed up!" Max turned to see Allison Watts smiling down at him. He glanced down at his shirt. A burst of tie-dye swirled up at him. "I didn't, actually," he said. Allison smirked. "Just that California lifestyle?" Max grinned. He hated when other people made lame California jokes, but Allison earned a pass because she helped him find the chemistry lab on his first day. Not that he expected her to remember that now. Allison was the kind of person who helped classmates with homework in the hallway before first period, who always waited the appropriate amount of time before answering teachers' questions, which turned into a classroom hero instead of a show-off, and who had an intensity about her that made Max feel like he wanted to be a part of her story. He could tell she'd become someone great one day. a president or an inventor or a CEO of a company that made flying cars. So when Allison cracked a joke about California, Max found that it made his stomach flip in a way that interfered with his ability to grimace. He opened his mouth to introduce himself, but no sound emerged. That day, like the past 3 days, he thought about asking her out. But then he thought about her rejecting him and how he'd have to awkwardly eject himself from the situation, which made himself walking through town with his sister howling about bazookas sound like a fun weekend activity. Allison watched his face, which must have been cycling through expressions of both hope and abject fear. When he still didn't speak, her smile softened. "Well," she said, "I'll see you around, California." "Bye," Max called after her, deflated. He told himself she was a human being, not some otherworldly goddess. He told himself he could just talk to her and walk up to her, but the thought made him feel the way the ferry ride to Catalina Island had on his 9th birthday, weak-kneed and queasy. How was it possible that he'd fallen for her so hard in just 2 weeks? As Max shouldered his backpack and walked up the concrete steps, he cut past 6 of his classmates, all of them crowded together and gossiping about the old Sanderson house at the edge of town. "I'm telling you, we should go there before the party," said a girl in an orange turtleneck. Over the turtleneck, she wore a slouchy blue sweater patterned with pumpkins. "No way," whined her friend, who wore a red vest over a white sweater and looked more excited for Christmas than Halloween. She leaned against the front steps, metal handrail. "I'm not going anywhere near that house. It's creepy." Max had to agree with the second girl. He'd seen the Sanderson house the previous weekend on a ride, and its rotting walls and saging windows seemed to peer out from the woods as he cruised past. He also noticed the "closed indefinitely" sign tied along the wrought iron gate fence that separated the Sanderson house and much of Salem Wood from the actual town of Salem. A boy who wore a brown sweater over a white shirt threw an arm around his shoulders of the girl in the red vest. "I'll just have to hold you closer, Tess," he teased, grinning. Tess beamed up at him. "My hero," she signed, and then snorted as her head settled on the boy's chest. Their semicircle of friends laughing along with her, Max felt the seed of a plan begin to take root. Another glorious morning makes me sick. We're in Salem of 1693, when Emily Binks woke to the dreamy light of dawn. She first believed it was due to the cocks crowing in the yard, but for whatever reason, the animals weren't making a single sound. Emily crept to the window and found the roosters asleep, even the chickens, who clucked softly as they dozed. It was so strange that she slipped out of the house, Jocelyn, without changing from her bedclothes, an act that would surely scandalize her mother if she caught her. There was a soft song in the air that sounded nothing like birds, but also not quite like the hymns the pastor's wife led at church. It sounded more like the delicate crust on sugar almonds or the sweet cream of Christmas custard. It sounded like something that could melt or sour if it wasn't used up right away. Emily stepped into the yard and past the clustered chickens and nodding family of sheep whose coats were thickening for winter. She petted the nose of Mopsy, the black pony her father had brought back from last year's trip to Boston, and giggled when he released a happy little snort. She passed the miner's house and the butcher's, but their curtains were drawn and their houses stood silent. A dawning rabbit was napping in the yard of the town's best baker, as if it was settled down to sleep in the open, unafraid of hungry foxes or rowdy boys with sticks. Elizabeth, the baker herself, was awake, though. There was a smell of boiling fruit and sugar, and Emily spotted her through the shutters of her kitchen window, humming to herself. Elizabeth lived in a small cottage on the edge of town with her husband and her daughter. Though they were scarcely seen since the witch trials had begun in Salem, those who did see her when she dropped off baked goods remarked on her simple beauty. She was a tall woman in her early 20s with dark curly hair, and she wore her pale yellow cloak in almost any weather. A little girl around Emily's age peeped her head just above the still. The girl had clear chestnut eyes and a chipper smile, and she gave Emily a friendly wave. "Ismay, get away from the windows!" came a man's voice from within the house, hushed and urgent. The little girl ducked away. Elizabeth stepped up to the open window and locked eyes with Emily. "What brings you outside so early this morning, Miss Emily?" Elizabeth inquired, pushing the window open to better see the girl. "And how on earth did your mother let you outside with any shoes, my dear?" Emily giggled. "The whole world seems to be asleep." "John Baker's ale must have been strong last night," said Elizabeth. She held up the apples she was slicing. "I'll have pie later, but you won't be allowed in until we've changed. And also, you've changed." Emily nodded somberly. "I'm going to find the music first," she said. Elizabeth's demeanor turned suddenly grave. "Don't follow it," she warned. "But it's prettier than any tune I've ever heard before." "Miss Elizabeth," said Emily, "beautiful things have a way of obscuring danger, my dear girl. Don't." She stopped short as the smell of burning fruit filled the air and the sound of clumsy gurgling reached her ears. She hastened to remove the delicate pre-serve from the stove, but when she returned to the window a moment later, Emily was already gone. Salem, 1993, Jocelyn. Max wasn't sure why everyone feeling into U.S. history at the end of the day had grins on their faces. The classroom looked as it had for the past few weeks, with orange construction paper tacked to the pushpin boards that flanked the chalkboard at the front of the room. On one side was a silhouette of a frightened black cat, and on another a silhouette of a witch on her broom. Above the chalkboard, Miss Olin had replaced the framed portraits of her 4 favorite presidents with the pen and ink drawings of 4 people involved in the Salem witch trials. Miss Olin herself sat at her desk while the class filled in scrawling notes to herself among an array of miniature pumpkins. There was a creepy little witch doll propped up at the front of her desk. It was dressed in black and white pilgrim's costume and pointed hat with an orange ribbon for decoration, exactly like the one Mrs. Olin herself wore that day. Max took his seat in the 3rd row beside the girl in the red vest and just a few desks away from Allison Watts. After the bell rang, Miss Olin explained, for her benefit, he exposed, that Salem tradition dictated that All Hallows Eve, each class history teacher recounted the town's most popular Halloween story. One that had real witches and bubbling cauldrons and unbreakable spells. The way she said it made Max realize that she was trying to express what a great honor this was for her, and that he found himself concentrating on not rolling his eyes. But when Miss Olin began to tell a story about the Sanderson Sisters, who had lured a girl into the woods and killed her, then turned her brother into a cat, Max knew there was someone smiling down on him, and all he had to do was provoke Allison into an argument, which would give him an excuse to apologize and invite her to check out the Sanderson house. It wouldn't be hard. This may have been only his second Friday at Jacob Bailey High, but he knew Allison couldn't stand it when people fibbled their way through a class discussion. He learned it the hard way when he tried to express her on Tuesday by swaggling through a devil's advocate position about states' rights, something he knew next to nothing about. He found that while Allison might be willing to help people with homework before class, she didn't find it charming if she thought you were making a mockery of something she cared about. She'd taken no prisoners, and he'd gone straight home to actually read the chapter about the Continental Congress. But now he would use one of his new talents. Specifically being publicly humiliated by Allison Watts to his advantage. And so, said Mrs. Olin, the very tip of her witch's hat bobbling as she spoke, the Sanderson sisters were hanged by the Salem's townfolk. Now there are those who say that on Halloween night, a black cat still guards the old Sanderson house, warning off any who might make the witches come back to life. With a loud pop, a mess of streamers shot from her hand onto the nearest girl, making the whole class jump. Max had to admit it was a nice touch. It was also his cue. "Give me a break," he signed. Mrs. Olin turned an arched eyebrow on him. "Aha," she said. "We seem to have a skeptic in our midst, Mr. Dennison. Would you care to share your California laid-back, tie-dyed point of view?" The class howled with laughter, and Max again had to restrain himself from rolling his eyes at his U.S. history teacher. She wasn't the one whose feathers he needed to ruffle. "Okay, granted that you guys in Salem are all into these black cats and witches and stuff." "Stuff?" gasped and affronted Mrs. Olin. "Fine," Max pressed on, "but everyone knows that Halloween was invented by the candy companies." The class groaned. "It's a conspiracy," insisted Max. "It just so happens," said Allison like clockwork, "that Halloween is based on the ancient feast called All Hallows Eve." Max and the rest of the class turned to watch her take him apart. She leaned forward and spoke directly to him while she did it. Her expression was serious, and for a moment Max worried he'd really put his foot in it. "It's the one night of the year where the spirits of the dead can return to earth." The class cheered, and Allison smiled and accepted a high five from the pumpkin sweatered girl who sat behind Max. At least she wasn't actually that upset, he reasoned. Having the whole class turned against him was a little embarrassing, but ultimately Max didn't care that they were celebrating his humiliation. He was already wearing and tearing a sheet of paper from his notebook and scribbling down his name. He paid Danny her weight in gummy pizzas to keep her away from this call. He got it from his desk. "Well," he said, crossing the narrow aisle, "in case Jimi Hendrix shows up tonight, here's my number." He handed Allison the folded sheet of paper. The class wooed and whooped. Allison raised her eyebrows at him but didn't answer. Max's heart slammed against his rib cage. A rubber ball trying to escape this risk-taking mad man. The bell rang and the class swirled out, Allison with them. Max grumbled to pack up his books and catch her before he lost his courage. Maybe if she gave him a chance, he'd actually make friends in Salem. And then Jack wouldn't have to lend Max his spare bunk after all. Salem in 1693. Thackeray joined, awake to the sound of Mopsy whining like he'd been kicked. He sat up straight, a layer of sweat sticking his pale linen shirt to his back, and let his ears adjust to the commotion outside the window. The sun was high. He must have slept through the cockcrow, which meant his father would be angry because he hadn't yet milked the cow. Thackeray flopped back into bed, wondering whether he could plead sick. He glanced to his left, hoping he could ask Emily to cover for him, but her bed was empty and unmade. Her church dress still hung by the fire, as did her grumbling cat. Thackeray hurried out of bed and looked about the small plain bedroom they shared at the back of the house. Emily's shoes were by the door, which was very unlike her. He sniffed the air but couldn't catch the smell of wood smoke. That would mean his mother was preparing porridge in the main part of the house. Nor could he hear the good-natured sound of his father greeting neighbors as they passed on their way back from the harbor. Something wasn't right. He dashed into the yard where the chickens were scrambling as they knew it was time for supper. Mopsy had torn himself from the tree, and his lead hung limp and obnoxious from an upper branch. A shiver crept down Thackeray's spine. From the gate of the sheep's pen, Thackeray spotted Elijah Morris, his best friend, who was rubbing his eyes as if he had just risen as well. "Elijah!" he called, forgetting his own shoes as he crossed between the yards. When Thackeray grabbed Elijah's forearm, his friend turned to him, blinking as if coming out of a dream. Elijah was only a hair's width taller than Thackeray. At least that's what Thackeray had said, and wore an identical linen shirt and long locked hairstyle. The townsfolk called the two of them identical twins. Accidental. "Has thee seen my sister, Emily?" asked Thackeray. "Nay," said Elijah, "but look, they conjure." Thackeray followed his friend's gaze and saw, far past the fields that surrounded town and deep within the Salem wood, a plum of heavy smoke crawling into the clearing late morning sky. It was an unnatural shade of pink, bright and conspicuous. It made his stomach turn. "The woods!" Thackeray managed, the half-dreamed ghost of witchy hands tightening around his neck. He grabbed Elijah by the shirt sleeve, and together they raced down the lane and to the field. There Thackeray caught sight of his sister's slight frame slipping into the shadow of the trees. "Wake my father," he told Elijah, keeping his eyes trained on when his sister had just seen. "Summon the others, go!" Before Elijah could answer, Thackeray was racing towards the witchy wood, shouting his sister's name. He leaped over one branch and ducked beneath another, and then lost his footing and tumbled down the steep embankment until he landed in a thick bed of browned leaves. He ground, forcing himself up onto one arm and then further onto his hurting bare feet. Before him stood the Sanderson house, a cottage that sat crookedly upon his hatchets and sagged in its heaves despite it being younger than many buildings in the Salem proper. Intricate wooden shutters obscured its windows, and weeds grew in thick drifts around the house and even between some of the floorboards of the porch. A few sported bright blue flowers, despite the chill of October's last day. Thackeray had no doubt that these blossoms smelled and tasted like honey, but would kill a man within a few minutes. On the house's left side, a huge water wheel caught the tiny creek and turned, groaning from the labor. Above it, the smoke hung thick and promised something as wicked as a snake in paradise. Emily disappeared inside as Thackeray watched, helpless, trapped by a memory of clambering down with Elijah when both of them were 12, of daring each other to throw pebbles at the door, of his heart knocking hard against his chest when the door opened and Winifred Sanderson stepped out with her wild red hair and threatened to roast them with chickens of the woods and worn snake tongues. Thackeray pushed aside his memories and crossed the flat stepping stones to a low window that looked into the only room of the house. Inside, the sisters were doing the devil's work, each of them wearing a heavy cape with a pointed hood. One green as leaves before the fall, one red as clay, and one a purple deeper than an elderberry's juice. Together, the women danced and rocked slowly around his poor, sweet sister. They had seated Emily in a heavy-looking chair, and she looked patiently up at them as if she expected a presence at the end of it all. Her eyes widened when she saw Thackeray, and he hurried out of sight and shut the window. He wasted no time, clambering past the water wheel and ducking into an alcove just as the creak of a rusted hinge pierced the air. The high, haughty voice of Winifred Sanderson rang out above him. "Oh, look!" she sighed. "Another glorious morning makes me sick." The window slammed shut again, and Thackeray leaned into the stone of the old building. He was relieved not to have been caught. But it didn't help the feeling that his ribs were knotted tight with rope. Emily was trapped inside with the witches, and he had no idea what to do. Salem in 1993. Hundreds of students pressed through the halls of the high school and spilled onto the street. In the anonymity of the crowd, a couple of students popped off black and orange streamers. A boy with a dancing skeleton knitted on his bingy shouted, "What do we want?" "Ghosts!" shouted back the rest of the school. "When do we want them?" "Now!" Max pushed his way through the celebrants, still baffled by their unself-conscious love of something meant for little kids. He was grateful that Allison wore a bright red coat because it helped him keep track of her in the outgoing tide of students. He grabbed his bike and raced after her, slowly only because he was afraid of becoming a gross, sweaty mess. His heart was beating hard enough for what he was about to do, Jocelyn. He was going to speak with Allison, just the two of them, and he was going to invite her to visit the Sanderson house with him. And she was going to say yes, because if she didn't, he really would have to hitchhike back to LA, since the embarrassment of seeing her in class every day would be too much when all of his friends were 3,000 miles away. Max's parents and sisters kept telling him to make the most of this move, and there he was, pedaling after his moonshot. As he biked, he decided that he'd never seen so much Halloween decor in one place, not even in the holidays section of the department store. There were homemade ghosts and plastic zombies, giant googly eyes stuck in trees. People even put up yellow and orange lights, and one man was testing the fog machine in his yard before the night's main event. Max swung past a honking car and into Salem Column, and the big part that sat in the middle of town. "Allison!" he barked before he could stop himself. He startled himself even, his foot slipping and causing him to skid to a halt. She turned and eyed him for a second before saying, "Hi!" She kept walking, but slowed a little. "Hi," he said, towing his way after her. "Look, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to embarrass you in class." "You didn't." She stopped then, and Max did too. He took a deep breath and told himself to play it cool. "My name is Max Dennison," he said, extending a hand. Allison softened. "Yeah, I know," she said, accepting his handshake. Her palm was soft and warm against his, and he thought of the intriguing cases and vases he'd seen her carrying out of the art's wing, even to stock a mansion, because he suspected she'd keep working at it until one came out perfect. He wondered whether asking about her ceramics class would make him seem thoughtful or creepy. "You just moved here, huh?" she asked, saving him the embarrassment. "Yeah, 2 weeks ago." He grabbed his handlebars so she wouldn't notice his shaking hands. "Must be a big change for you." "That's for sure," she smiled. "You don't like it here?" With 2 questions, Max felt like this conversation was really on a roll. He shrugged. "Oh, the leaves are great," he said, looking up at their fiery underbellies. "But, I don't know, just all this Halloween stuff." "You don't believe in it?" "What do you mean, like the Sanderson Sisters?" "No way." "Not even on Halloween?" His heart soared. He wasn't from Salem, but this was something he could work with. The universal teenage language of apathy. "Especially not on Halloween," he said. Allison seemed to hesitate, and Max wondered whether he misread something. No one his age could actually believe in witches and flying broomsticks and newt-eyed potions. Could they? But Allison just smiled and offered him a folded piece of paper, more suave than he could ever have hoped to be. "Trick or treat," she said. The look she gave him made his bones melt. She walked off then, pulling up her red hood against the October chill. Max smiled to himself, and for a moment he wasn't even upset that he had forgotten to ask her about visiting the Sanderson house. He'd spoken to Allison one-on-one, and she hadn't laughed at him or anything. Maybe this meant they could be friends. Maybe it even meant that one day, if he didn't mess things up, they could be something more than that. Max unfolded the note and saw his own name and phone number, and his stomach sank. He turned over the paper, but there wasn't anything else written on any part of it. He had misread her, though he wasn't sure how, and then he'd blown it. Max signed and looked down at the sidewalk. At least he still had his sweet new shoes. Let's brew another batch. Salem, 1693. "My darling," crooned Winifred Sanderson, and Thackeray was sure the words were meant for Emily. But then she added, equally lovingly, "My little book, we must continue with our spell now that our little guest of honor has arrived. Wake up," she coaxed, like a mother to her child. "Wake up, darling. Yes, oh, come along. There you are." Thackeray clambered up the water wheel, which allowed him to enter the house through a thick paned window on the 2nd floor. It opened to a narrow loft that looked down onto the large room, which made it the perfect hiding spot. Thackeray slunk in and pressed himself as close to the floorboards as he could manage, peering down at his sister and the witches below. "Ah, there it is," Winifred was saying. Her book was open to an angled table, and a massive iron pot was bubbling over an open fire beside her. She read from the book's pages. "Bring to a full roiling bubble. Add 2 drops of oil and boil. Mix blood of owl with the herb that's red. Turn 3 times and pluck a hair from my head. Add a dash of pox and a dead man's toe." She turned to Sarah, the narrowest sister, and perhaps the youngest, though no one in Salem seemed to remember. "Dead man's toe," Winifred ordered, "and make it a fresh one." Sarah Sanderson brightened then and began to dance around, chorusing the command, and Thackeray cringed. He thought of George Flamstead, the kind old fisherman whose boat had capsized in late September. He washed ashore untouched, except that he'd been missing both of his big toes. For days after the townsfolk had whispered about the devil's work, Mary tossed a toe into the pot and then flung another one at Sarah for good measure. When a wayward digit landed upon Winifred's back, she rounded on them both. "Will you two stop that?" she demanded. "I need to concentrate." She turned back to her book and then, satisfied, called her sisters to the pot. The surface of the bubbling liquid was obscured by a thick sheet of white smoke. As Thackeray spied, he chewed his bottom lip, tasting blood. Emily sat quietly off to the side, and he wondered what could possibly be going through her head. He'd seen a flash of recognition from her before, but now she sat as serenely as the doll he believed her to be when the midwife had first wrapped her in a clean blanket. "One more thing and all is done," chanted Winifred, waving her hands over the surface of the pot. "Add a bit of thine own tongue." At once, all three sisters stuck out their tongues and bit down with a crunch, turning Thackeray's stomach. They spat into the pot and began to stir the vile liquid with a large wooden spoon. "One drop of this," breathed Winifred, "and her life will be mine." She called herself. "I mean ours." Thackeray looked over his shoulder, but there wasn't a single sound outside. Where was Elijah? Where was his father? Surely they'd arrive at any moment. When the sisters began to advance on Emily, Winifred carrying the huge spoon of the dark, bubbling potion, Thackeray jumped up. "No!" he shouted, leaping forward from the loft before they could feed any of their wicked brew to his sister. "A boy!" growled Winifred. "Get him, you fools!" Thackeray dodged the two younger witches, dancing around the bubbling pot so they couldn't catch him. He grabbed the lid of the pot and shoved, not caring about the shearing pain that shot through his hands. Once the poison was spilled across the ground, he rushed toward his sister, but it was too late. Winifred had given her the draught of potion left in that huge wooden spoon. The decrepit witch, delicately, even lovingly, wiped his sister's mouth with her own croak before turning to face him. "Always keep your eyes on the prize, my boy," she crackled as she raised her free hand, the air filled with a violent green light. All at once, Thackeray's world filled up and spilled over with hurt. His muscles betrayed him. His field of vision blurred and went black, and his body collapsed like a bundle of sticks on the floor. Salem, 1993. Max decided to take the long way home to get some time to think. He pedaled hard through Salem, avoiding anyone who might want to talk to him. An adamantly limited group since he was so new in town, and only slowed when he reached the edge of the graveyard marked by a wonked iron gate topped with the words "Old Burial Hill." He realized it was very bloody and brawdy to spend time in a cemetery, but it was also a peaceful place with rolling hills and craggy walks that on a northern rise overlooked Salem and the harbor. Seeing the ocean had given him comforting feelings his very last day first day in Salem, and he reminded him of home and of the unending expanse of the Pacific. The idea that this place was even a little like LA made his heart ache, but it also made him feel like maybe he could make the most of it here. Maybe his life didn't have to be so different after all. The crest of the cemetery's hill was the kind of place he'd want to take Allison one day after they'd gotten to know each other enough that she didn't think that he was secretly an axe murderer. They could watch the ships come in and go out, cutting through deep blue water with rolling wide caps, and wait for the lighthouse to come on as the sun started to go down. He could tell her about California and listen while she explained why she liked Salem, and maybe he'd find a way to like it too. Max rounded a section of tombstones and headed for the top of the hill. Just then, a boy shouted, "Halt!" Max stopped, confused, and turned to see Jay Taylor, the blonde portion of the duo that terrorized Salem with the poorly constructed bottle rockets and the occasional roll of toilet paper. Max groaned inwardly. Just then, Ernie popped up from behind a particularly large gravestone. Max looked from Jay with his straight shoulder-length hair and fingerless gloves to Ernie, whose brown windbreaker was still too large for his thick torso, and he wondered how they'd befriended each other on the playground. Jay tossed his blonde hair. "Who are you?" Max debated, pedaling away, but the front of his bike was pointed uphill, and it would take too long to swing it around. Besides, this day had to come sooner or later. "Max," he said shortly, "I just moved here." "From where?" Jay asked. "Los Angeles." Jay gave him a perplexed look, and Max realized that this might be the first person he encountered who was too stupid to provide a surf's-up joke. He counted his blessings. "L.A.," he clarified. "Oh," said Jay happily. "Dude!" "Tubular," said Ernie. That train was never too late. Max took a steady breath through his nose. "I'm Jay," said Jay, "and this is Ernie." Ernie grabbed the elbow of Jay's black pleather jacket and pulled him into a crouch. "How many times I gotta tell you," he grumbled. "My name ain't Ernie no more. It's Ice." "This is Ice," Jay clarified, pointing. Ernie spun around to show off the back of his head, where his nickname was shaved in block letters. Max chuckled. He suddenly wasn't sure why he had been worried about these two at all. "So," said Jay, jumping back from the tombstone he'd been perched on, "let's have a butt." "No thanks," said Max. "I don't smoke." "They're very health conscious in Los Angeles," mocked Ernie. Jay broke into a raucous laughter, and Ernie followed suit. They gave each other a double high five and a chest bump, and Max wondered how long they'd been stuck in his new kid hazing ritual. "You got any cash, Hollywood?" asked Jay, coming down to block Max's way. He leaned forward on Max's handlebars. Max felt his pulse hiccup. "No," he said, trying to regain control of the bike. "Gee," said Ernie, grabbing Max's biceps. Max turned to him, and his heart was full on pattering. He waited around too long, and even if these two were dumb, they were still bigger than him and seemed to have twitchy moral compasses. "We don't get any smokes from you. We don't get any cash. What am I supposed to do with my afternoon?" said Jay. Max inhaled slowly. "Maybe learn to breathe through your nose," he said. Jay guaffled and quickly pretended to find the ground very interesting. "Whoa," he said, noticing Max's shoes. "Check out the new cross trainers." Max tried to pull away, but Ernie was even stronger than he looked. "Cool," Ernie said to Jay, his grip on Max's arms tightening even further. "Let me try 'em on." Max looked from boy to the other, hoping they were joking. The Nikes had been the only good thing about his move to Salem. Ernie gave him a look that said, "I'm waiting," and before Max knew it, he was biking away from them shoeless, the threads of his pedals sharp and uncomfortable, even though his socks. At least they hadn't thought to take his bike, he told to himself. He was angry at himself for not getting away before Jay and Ernie cornered him. He was mad at his dad for accepting the transfer to a new management position in Salem. And he was mad at Danny for making the move look so easy when it was clearly so painfully lame. At the top of Old Burial Hill, the cemetery chapel chimed 4 o'clock. Max signed and continued biking down the hill back toward town. Both of his parents would be home by now, as would Danny. He lost his Nikes, his shot with Allison, and his chance at privacy, and it wasn't even dinner time. Salem, 1693. Thackeray's mind went blank from the pain in his body. When he could finally blink again, he wasn't sure whether he lost a few seconds or a few minutes or much longer. He tipped his head to the side and saw that Emily was still there, as were the three hideous Sanderson sisters. Emily sat serenely in the wooden chair, attentive but church quiet. Her pale skin and white, deep sleep dress looked almost indolescent in the house's low light. Thackeray watched helpless as that adolescence turned into a warm, golden glow as the likes of which one might expect to see spill from the skin of an angel. "'Tis her life force," said Winifred. "The potion works." She stretched her arms toward her sisters. "Take my hands, we will share her." Fingers intertwined. The three witches advanced upon Emily. They leaned forward and inhaled deeply. Curls of ember light drift away from Emily and down their wretched throats. Thackeray dragged himself into a nearby ladder and managed to prop himself up, but the world sloshed around him and he couldn't think of how the words were supposed to be strung together. He watched his sister, though, and felt his heart would break. The sisters took a final inhale, and the light around Emily disappeared behind their lips. Emily's narrow chin tipped forward, and her body went limp. Her face was suddenly drawn and shallow. Her skin threatened with thin, gray veins, as if her blood, too, had been stolen from her. Thackeray lurched toward her, but only managed to vomit onto the floor. He tried to look away from his sister, but he couldn't help staring at her in horror. Emily, dead. Dead and shrunken like a frail old woman. Thackeray vomited again. He hadn't eaten since supper, and the thin bile from his stomach sored his tongue. Sarah Sanderson spun around, running fingers through her newly golden curly hair. "I am beautiful," she squealed. "Boys will love me." Mary's plump face looked nearly pleasant, thanks to the color creeping back into her cheeks. She pouted her red lips, which still twisted to one side. "We're young," she laughed, clapping. Winifred hurried to pick up a mirror. Her face fell, and for a moment, Thackeray suspected she wished she hadn't been so gorgeous and so generous in sharing with her sisters. "Well," she said, "younger." Then a surge of energy seemed to ripple through her, and she raised both arms in triumph. "But it's a start," she cackled. The sisters permitted tea together, while Thackeray continued to drag himself onto unsteady feet. "Oh, Winifred," cooed Mary, "thou art a mere sprung of a girl." "Liar!" Winifred crowned. "But I shall be a sprung of a girl forever," she said, twirling each of her sisters. "Once I suck the life out of all the children in Salem." She turned to face Thackeray and beamed, then advanced on him. "Let's brew another batch," she suggested. "You hag!" he growled. "There are not enough children in the world to make thee young and beautiful." That made Winifred stop short. "Hag?" she repeated distastefully. "Sisters, did you hear what he called you?" Thackeray wanted to point out that he'd been speaking pacifically to her, but she spoke again before he could muster the energy. "Whatever shall we do with him?" "Barbecue and fillet him," suggested Mary. "Hang him on a hook," said Sarah, reaching for his chest, "and let me play with him." "No," snapped Winifred. And then, more softly, she called for her book. The heavy tome floated through the air to reach her. The book was bound in straps of thick, tanned human skin and roughly stitched together with thread that made the seams look like scars on a dead man's face. A metal clasp on the book's cover encircled a bit of puckered leather in the shape of an eye. "Dazzle me, my darling," she crooned. The book opened on its own accord, and she paged through it until she found the perfect spell. "His punishment shall not be to die, but to live forever with his guilt." "As what, Winnie?" his sisters asked, delighted. She stepped toward Thackeray, and though she tried to evade her walnut brown eyes and the sight of her large teeth and narrow pursed lips, his ears filled with her chanting. "Twist the bones and bend the back," she said, and her sisters mumbled a soft spell beneath her words. Thackeray winced, but Winifred went on. "Trim him of his baby fat. Give him fur as black, just like this." Thackeray felt his body twisting and turning and on itself, felt his bones snapping and reshaping into smaller, thinner versions of themselves. The last spell had felt like lightning beneath his skin, but this felt like terrible bubbling in his narrow, and even his screamed. He heard his voice come back in a shrill yowl. The house rattled with the pounding of fists on its doors and its windows. Through his pain, Thackeray heard his father's voice, but it was too late. He dragged himself to safety under a chest of drawers and let the pain sweep over his body, through his mind, spiriting his conscience away. Salem, 1993. Once home, Max went straight up to his room and flopped onto the bed. He hated the sailboat wallpaper of his room almost as much as he did the pale purple paint that trimmed the steps leading to the small loft overhead. He tried to make it look more like his last room, carefully placing drum set to take up as much space as possible. He'd even tack up a tie-dyed blanket Jack sent him after Max told him about the California hippie jokes. None of his attempts, though, had worked. This old nursery didn't look anything like his room, and staring at it just made him feel more alone. So he glared at the white popcorn ceiling and listened to the quiet bobbling of the fish tank beside his bed. The bike ride home hadn't calmed his anger. If anything, Jocelyn, the pedals cutting into his feet had stoked it. Why couldn't his parents have waited 2 more years before moving? Then he'd have graduated and gone to college, and they would have moved Danny anywhere they liked. Besides, who transferred their kids to a new school in the middle of October? Max squeezed his eyes shut and sighed. October made him think about Halloween, which made him think about Allison and her note. He'd really blown it, and he still didn't get how. Did Allison like Halloween because she liked to dress up, or because of this weird witchy town, or because she actually believed in spells that could transfer people into immortal cats? Max wasn't sure which option he preferred. He rolled over as if it mattered, as if he had a chance with her either way. "Allison," he sighed, remembering her hand in his when he introduced himself, his smoothest move of the day. "You're so soft," he continued. "I just wanna..." His closet burst open and Max sat up with a racing pulse. "Boo!" Danny crackled, blowing herself for such a good prank. She was still in her costume, and her patterned skirt swished as she danced. I scared you! Max blushed. Danny clambered over him and tossed herself onto his bed. She thrashed about, crooning, "I'm Allison! Kiss me! I'm Allison!" which only made Max blush harder. He stood up. "Mom and Dad told you to stay out of my room." "Don't be such a crab," Danny said, rolling her eyes. She stood up on his mattress to make herself taller, then began to jump, the yellow and orange fringe of her jacket swinging wildly. The mattress springs protested each time she landed. Guess what? She asked. Then, before he could answer, you're going to take me trick-or-treating. She couldn't be serious. Not this year, Danny. Danny twirled and leaped off the bed. Mom said you have to. Well, said Max, she can take you. She and Dad are going to the pumpkin ball downtown. She protested, tugging on his sleeve. You're 8, he said, jerking away from her. Go by yourself. He crossed the room, sat down on his drum set, and tapped at the beat on the snare. No way, said Danny. This is my first time. I'll get lost. Besides, it's a full moon outside. The weirdos are out. Max ignored her, throwing in a hi-hat. If Jack had been there, he would have plugged in his guitar and they would have been halfway through London Calling by now. Danny threw her arms around his neck. Come on, Max, she said. He signed and let his sticks settle across one knee. Can't you forget about being a cool teenager for one night? She begged. Please come out. We used to have so much fun together trick-or-treating, remember? It'll be like old times. He jerked away. The old days are dead, he said, restarting the beat. He knew he'd end up taking her, but he wished to God she'd just give him 5 minutes alone. He needed to think. He needed to listen to Green Day. He needed to not walk around with his kid sister dressed as Winona, the whimsical witch. It doesn't matter what you say, Danny declared. You're taking me. Max tossed down his sticks. Wanna bet? He crossed the room again, this time climbing into the small loft that was the best part of his new room. The best part of Massachusetts, as far as he was concerned, especially now that Allison thought he was an idiot and his sneakers were getting snatched by Ernie's club feet and stretched out. He crossed his arms and leaned against the wall. Danny's eyes narrowed, and she did the thing she always turned arguments into her favor. She screamed for their mother. This is terribly uncomfortable. Salem in 1693. The verdict was settled before the trial began, but the Sanderson witches' case was not helped by the refusal to show remorse. That very same night, a dark, dazzling end to All Hallows' Eve, the 3 sisters stood on barrels, stinking of fish. 3 lengths of rope looped around 3 guilty necks, and they cracked and teased the crowd as their sentences were read under the light of flickering lanterns and hungry-looking torchers. They're mad, said the tray maker to the miner. When did they turn so mad? When they sold their souls to the devil in a despiteful tryst with yellow hellfire and wickedness, said the miner as if he'd been there. Mused the tray maker. It seems to help Sarah's complexion, though. It began to rain there, flat drops that soaked woolen tonics and ran into well-solen boots. The judge, who was also the priest of Salem, and 2 bordering townships, and in his humble opinion, severely overworked and underappreciated, tried to speed things along. What say thee witches? He demanded. Sarah Sanderson tittered on her barrel. We say thou weren't so judgy when coming to us last May for a potency potion. She cast her eyes below the man's round stomach and patted her lashes as the crowd broke into whispers and shifted from one soggy foot to the other. Lying Jezebel! Cried the judge. But before Sarah could retort, the father of the dead Emily spoke up. Winifred Sanderson, he said, I will ask thee one final time, what hast thou done with my son Thackeray? Thackeray? Asked the eldest witch. In the dim torch light, her face looked like chalk against the scarlet of her curls. Answer me! He shouted. His arm was around the shoulders of his wife, who wept openly into his damp jacket. Well, I don't know. Winifred protested, then gave her sisters a knowing secret smile. Cat's got my tongue! The Sanderson witches shrieked with laughter at Winifred's joke. As the sound of it died down, Sarah chafed at the rope around her neck. This is terribly uncomfortable, she said. Winifred cleared her throat, and before anyone in Salem could stop them, the Sanderson witches began to sing and chant in unison. Thrice I with mercury purify and spit upon the 12 tables. Don't listen, cried the judge. Cover your ears! The gathered mass rushed to heed him as the sisters spat into the crowd. Don't drop the book, someone shouted. But it was too late. Elijah Morris, a judge's apprentice, and a boy who'd lost his best friend to these wicked sisters only that morning, covered his ears too, dropping Winifred's leather-bound spell book as he did. The heavy thing sank into the mud with a satisfied squish. A moment later, it flew open to its own accord, hundreds of pages shuddering and cackling in the wind. Mary and Sarah looked gleefully at it, the latter clapping her slender hands. But Winifred, the eldest, let her gaze linger on the back of the crowd, her brown eyes piercing and gone, almost black, but her expression somehow bemused, like a cat who just transformed her master into a crumpled mouse. Then her attention slapped back to her spell book. A laugh tumbled out of her broad chest. Fools! She crowded, relishing the word. All of you, my ungodly book speaks to you. On All Hallows Eve, when the moon is round, a virgin will summon us from under the ground. Her delight bumbled over into her sisters, who giggled and beamed alongside her. We shall be back, Winifred proclaimed, and the lives of all the children of Salem shall be mine. White lightning cracked across the sky, and the executioner, dressed all in black, kicked down the barrels. Sarah, Winifred, and Mary dropped in quick succession. Their bodies shuddered, and their toes stretched on swinging stocking legs, and at last they were still and singing no more. As the crowd began to shuffle off, the spell book was closed and lifted. As the book rose, the eyelid on its cover bleaked open, and the watery green iris searched out its rescuer. Through the film of cataracts and rain, the spellbook's eye saw thick, dark curls obscuring a face, and then it was tucked beneath an arm and secreted away. Salem of 1993. Danny and Max had only been trick-or-treating for 10 minutes, but Max was already angling to go home. Before leaving the house, Danny had begged him to put on a costume, and he relented by putting on sunglasses, a baseball cap, and an oversized suede jacket that belonged to their dad. He pulled the brim low as they walked, and the grimace on his face said that there was no universe in which this night would turn out to be fun for him. Lighten up, Max, Danny said, leading him to the next house. He plopped onto the porch step to wait as she slided up the door after a pink princess and a pirate. What a festive little witch you are, said the woman who answered the door. Max rolled his eyes. When Danny came back, pleased with both her haul and the compliment, she handed Max the extra candy bar she'd taken for him. Can we go home now? He asked, dropping the chocolate into his bag. No! As they headed back down the walk towards the street, Max groaned. Danny! He startled, but it was too late. Jay and Ernie had rolled up and were holding court with their goons. Jay was in a pumpkin smashing contest with a beanie-wearing sophomore, and Ernie was perched on the brick and concrete wall of the steps that Max and Danny had to take to return to the street. Max pivoted, deciding to cut across the lawn and walk down the driveway of the neighboring house. Danny did not get the memo. Ding, 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 ding! Ernie thrilled. At that, Jay hurried over to Danny. Stop and pay the toll, kid. 10 chocolate bars, no licorice, added Ernie. Dump out your sack. Danny wrinkled her brow, unimpressed. Drop dead, moron. Around them, the boys in denim jackets and ill-advised hats let out a chorus of shocked, delighted whoops and whistles. Yo, twerp! Ernie quickly cut in. How'd you like to be hung off that telephone pole? I'd like to see you try, said Danny. It just so happens I've got my big brother with me. She looked over her shoulder at Max, who was staying in the background, dreaming of dodging the boys by heading back down the block, but not willing to abandon his sister. Max! Danny said. Hollywood! Ernie called in recognition. Max stuffed his hands into his pockets and looked away. This time, the swell of sound bubbled with laughter. Awkward! Intoned a boy with the world's smallest ear gouges. So, said Jay, swaggering over to Max, you're doing a little trick-or-treating, huh? He mimicked the action with Ernie, which gained a cheap laugh from his friends. I'm just taking my little sister around, Max said, stepping into Jay's personal space. Jay hummed. That's nice, he said. He slapped down the brim of Max's ball cap. Wow, I love the costume. He leaned in close. But what are you supposed to be? A new kid on the block? He grabbed Max's elbow to keep himself from falling over as he cracked up at his own joke. For your information, Danny announced, he's a little leaguer. The boys laughed hard at that, with Ernie pretending to strike a pitch from Jay with a tiny invisible bat. Max shouldered past them. Wait a minute, said Ernie, grabbing Max's shoulder. Everybody pays the toll. Stiff it, zip face, said Danny. Ernie dropped Max's jacket to turn on her. Why, you little... Hey! Max interrupted, putting himself between Danny and the bullies. Ice here, he said, and pressed his own paper bag of candy into Ernie's thick chest. Pig out! He took his sister by the arm. Come on, Danny, let's go. As he stalked down the block, Danny skipping to keep up with him, he heard Ernie send a last volley across the road. And Hollywood! The shoes fit great! Max let go of Danny's arm and shoved his hands into his coat pockets, his face burning. He didn't say anything as they made their way down the block. He could tell Danny was disappointed in him, which only made him more annoyed with her. It was great that she thought he could take 10 other guys in a fight, but seriously. Now, Jay and Ernie could never forget his face. And now that he'd given them both his shoes and his candy, without fighting back, they'll never leave him alone. He followed Danny up the front steps to another house. Should have punched him, Danny finally grumbled. She didn't look at Max. Her flip suggestion made Max's irritation flare. He would have killed me. At least you would have died like a man, she replied. Hey! Max imagined that Allison would have kept her cool and turned Danny's gathered stereotyping into a teaching moment, as she'd done with her geometry teacher, made a joke about girls being bad at math. But right now, he was just afraid that his little sister might be right. You just humiliated me in front of half the guys at school, he told her hotly. So collect your candy and get out of my life! Danny's eyes filled with tears. She brushed past him on her way back down the steps. I want to go home now! Max signed as she dashed through the yard and down the sidewalk. He hadn't really meant that, and he certainly shouldn't have said it out loud. It wasn't Danny's fault that Jay and Ernie and their gang were so awful. There was a display of haystacks and a seasonal detour in front of another house, and she tackled one of the pumpkins as if it were one of the fluffy pillows on her bed. Danny, Max said, walking over, I'm sorry. He sat down heavily on the hay next to her, shaking, sobbing sister. It's just that I hate this place, he said, snatching off his ball cap. I miss all my friends. I want to go home. This is your home now, Danny said over his shoulder. So just get used to it. She sniffled and wiped snot from her nose. Max sighed. If only it were that easy. Danny had always been better at rolling with the punches, but he also knew that just because she was, that didn't mean he should take out his own dislike of change on her. He leaned over. Yeah, he admitted, and then he asked gently, give me one more chance? Why should I? 'Cause I'm your brother? She turned to look at him, and Max gave her an agitated pout. She giggled, and the sound of her laugh made her smile too. And it also made him smile as well. Max looked up past the glare of the streetlights. Whoa, he said, check that out. What? Asked Danny seriously. The two of them stood up. Something just flew across the moon, Max said. Dandy wandered across to the street, closer and craning her neck. Max glanced down at her, smirked, and grabbed her around the waist, shouting. She squealed, breaking into another wave of giggles. Fooled ya! Max said, dusting hay off of her jacket. Danny relaxed for a moment against her big brother, and for a second it felt like they had been back home in Southern California happy. Let's go, jerkface, she said, tugging on his sleeve. They turned down the walk to the closest house and gasped in unison. And that is the end of today's story time with Jocelyn. We will see you next week to continue into the next 4 chapters of Hocus Pocus. God bless and have a blessed weekend. Bye-bye.